This is what's happening in Iran today. Watch. Joining me now from the Center for Security Policy, Clare Lopez. Clare, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you too. Thanks, Liz.
All right, Clare, a couple of points that need to be made, I think, about these protests that are happening in Iran. And I want to start with the idea, and this is, I think, coming from liberals here in America. They're claiming that these protests are mostly economic, that they're not so much a rejection of the Islamist theocracy, the regime in Iran. And I don't think that's correct. What may have started as economic is clearly, I mean, watching the videos, hearing what these people are saying, this is about the repressive regime. This is political.
Absolutely it is. This may have begun over economic hardship, but if you just listen to the clip that you just played right there, Liz, what that crowd was chanting, Marg bar dictator, means death to the dictator. The dictator here refers to the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
Right, and the reason for economic hardship is inherently political as well. I mean, this is not a poor nation. The nation of Iran should be a wealthy nation, but what they choose to do with their money, they choose to fund terrorism. Instead of taking care of their people, they are choosing terrorism, their political ideology, radical Islam, over the needs of their people, the well-being of their own people.
Absolutely, and the people know this. The people know that President Barack Obama sent shrink-wrapped pallets full of cash to the regime, but that money did not go to the people. They know that money went to prop up the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Damascus. That money goes to support the Shiite terror proxy of Iran, Hezbollah, also Hamas, and other terror groups. The people know this. And even as they're suffering economically from high unemployment, high prices, they know that this money that was given to Iran, to the regime, went outside to help prop up terrorism and dictators.
Right. Choosing very clearly, this is a black and white issue, choosing terrorism over choosing, like I said, building schools and hospitals for their own people. All right, the second point that I want to make, I want to talk to you about regime change, because there are people looking at this saying, well, what do these protesters want? Do they want regime change? Do they want help from Western nations to enact regime change? And if so, would the United States or other Western countries support that? And to start with, President Trump's response here has been very, very different, the polar opposite, really, of President Obama's response to similar protests that happened in 2009. Press Secretary Sarah Sanders was asked that question this afternoon during a press conference, and she said that the administration, the Trump administration, supports human rights and supports a government that doesn't repress individual liberties here, but she wouldn't go as far to say that that the administration would support regime change. Claire, should they?
Yes, in my opinion, we should support regime change, because that's clearly what the people of Iran want. That is what they're calling for in the streets of Iran. They are not calling anymore just for better economic conditions, although that would certainly be welcome. They want a complete overhaul of the regime. They want this regime gone. There are statements out there by groups like the National Iranian Congress, a group of university students that broadcast its statement yesterday on Fox News, saying they are looking for a democratic and a representative government that treats its people equally under rule of secular law. That is what they're chanting. This is way different than what they were saying back in 2009 when they just wanted some reforms.
Right, because as we need to remember, this is not a democracy. They might claim to be a democracy, but they're not. Any politician has to get the sign-off, the checkmark of approval from the current leaders who are in charge of a theocracy, a government built around Islamic law, not secular law. There are also reports coming from some of these protesters and some of the groups. It is a very loose movement. It doesn't have an incredible amount of cohesive leadership right now, but there are reports from these groups saying that if they don't get help, they believe the government and the IRGC will kill as many of the protesters as is necessary to silence them, to squash these protests. Operating under that premise, Claire, do you think that they will get help from any Western nations?
Well, we know that the statements made by President Trump already have provided enormous encouragement. We can't overestimate how much that means to those people on the streets over there. Just even the bully pulpit of the United States presidency supporting them. But other than that, another hopeful sign that I think we should mention is that we're seeing signs of division within the regime itself. And today we are just hearing now, I mean, a short time ago, that there are elements within the top supporters of the regime, the supporters of the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, calling for President Hassan Rouhani to resign, to step down, apparently because they consider him not hard line enough against the protesters. The other thing we can hope for is that the actual services themselves, the security services themselves, will find themselves hesitant, or at least not willing, to open fire on their countrymen. This should be encouraged. So there are many things the United States can do. One of the most important would be to help with communications by perhaps opening a dedicated broadband channel on one of our satellites that cannot be hacked or jammed by the regime, to help these protesters in different cities to coordinate and organize. So there are many things we can do. We can be very hopeful. I think from what we've heard from the Trump administration, that there's much going on behind the scenes that may not be apparent right at this moment.
Right, and a fascinating fact that plays into your call for internet that cannot be shut down by the regime, because that's happened. Social media has been blocked. Internet in some areas has been cut off. The difference, one of the main differences, too, between the protests in 2009 and the protests this year, about 1 million people in 2009 had smartphones compared to 48 million people this year have smartphones. They can't be cut off the same way from the internet, from outside news sources, from the world, when that many people have access to the news, access to the internet right there at their hands. And I think the government is running up against that. Last question, Claire. So not only is the response from Trump very different than Obama, but the response that we're seeing from Democrats now, and this is American Democrats, these are liberals in Europe. I mean, I have been shocked by the silence coming from Western nations in Europe. They have, 20 people have been killed in 6 days. We've heard next to nothing. The mainstream media here in the United States have their headlines, even on the screens during their news broadcasts, are talking about protests without talking about what sparked the protests, what the people want, the oppression that the Iranian people have suffered. Why the silence, and is that going to actually continue to aid the Iranian government in being repressive towards protesters?
You know, this is appalling and shameful. But in the end, I really do think that, just as you talked about, the explosion, really, of social media and the access and the ability to use the internet and different means of social media, from Instagram to Telegram to WhatsApp and so forth, that will serve as a very strong means of getting the information out there. I mean, on my phone alone, I am getting a constant stream of dozens and dozens and dozens of videos of protests that are taking place all over the country in Iran. This, too, is a difference from 2009, the widespread nature of the protests in so many cities and towns across the country. I think in the end, that overwhelming nature of the ability to get those videos and that information out will overcome the shameful silence of mainstream media and others who don't want to talk about this.
Right, and you're absolutely right. It is shameful. It is absolutely, it's hypocritical and it's shameful. It's immoral. It's not difficult for us to see what's happening to the people of Iran at the hands of their government. Gay people are killed because they're gay. Women aren't allowed to travel without the permission of their husbands. They're married off as young as 13 years old and not allowed to divorce abusive husbands. They're not allowed to go to men's sports games. They're forced to wear the hijab whether or not they want to, at the risk of arrest and punishment. I mean, it's hard at this point, I think, for feminists in the United States or liberals here or in Europe to argue that what's happening in Iran is anything other than a human rights abuse, and that, as Susan Rice, former national security advisor for President Obama, said, that the best thing that President Trump can do is to remain silent. That's a very hard argument and a losing argument to make at this point. Claire, I appreciate your analysis. Thanks for being here.